In less than a week, Syrian rebels have captured the largest city in the country, Aleppo, and are advancing further in northwestern Syria. Let's examine the military situation in this war-torn country. I'm Julian Röpke, and you're watching BILD Situation Room. And we start off with footage from the western entrance of Aleppo, the city with 2 million people, the bustling metropolis, the largest city in Syria, captured last Friday. Friday marked the third consecutive day of the Syrian rebels' offensive coming from the Idlib and Aleppo regions. Already in the preceding 2 days, they had successfully seized control of approximately 30 to 40 smaller towns and villages. And on Friday morning, they finally stood before the gates of Aleppo. And we have some footage here that shows the fighting taking place there. And there are mainly two large groups. First, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that is for the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant. That's the name, a terrorist organization listed in Germany. And the SNA, or the Syrian National Army. It's a large rebel coalition led by Turkey. These two groups initiated their parallel or simultaneous military offensives last Wednesday, with one occurring in Idlib and the other taking place in Aleppo, as previously mentioned. These areas are not only cities but also broader regions, and these are the initial moments where one has just arrived in New Aleppo, which is a western district of the city of Aleppo, and there were still some skirmishes. It looked as if the Syrian army was still resisting, as if it was trying to hold on to this largest city in the country, even larger than Damascus in terms of population, to defend. However, just a few hours later, not only were the clashes here in the western section of Aleppo finished, but also the center of the city was also under rebel control throughout the subsequent 48 hours. Subsequently, quarter by quarter, the regime of Syria, led by dictator Assad, gradually retreated. Assad, who has been waging a devastating war against his own people since the year 2011, has seen his army reportedly kill as many as 200,000 civilians according to objective sources. We recall about 6 million have fled from Syria, with nearly 2/3 of them going to Turkey. The rest headed to Europe, with approximately 1 million coming to Germany. Now there's plenty of joy. We saw it at demonstrations in Düsseldorf and elsewhere. Great joy among the Syrian refugees, because areas that were occupied by Assad, areas from which millions were displaced, primarily Sunnis, are now back under Sunni control. However, under the rule of very difficult groups. As mentioned, one of the two is considered a terrorist organization in Germany. And this group has now stated that they want a Syria for everyone, that they does not intend to establish an Islamic State similar to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban or IS, but instead they claim to support all Syrians and represent all the diverse communities and ethnicities within the country. We'll first take a look at the footage from Aleppo from the days that followed, and we can observe that a certain sense of calm and tranquility has settled in. The streets are open. Here we see a Christian neighborhood in Aleppo. We see that women are walking on the streets without veils, that they can still go shopping, at least currently. And those are the statements given by the Syrian rebel leaders, who are allowing the Christians in Aleppo to live in the manner that they prefer. Also the Shiites, there were also various cities captured that were dominated by the minorities, Alawites and Shiites, whom Assad represents. He is the president or dictator of the country in the tradition of his father, also as an Alawite from a minority actually. And here we see Syrian activists who are interviewing people on the street, and they are saying that so far it's okay. So far the rebels have left us in peace here, and we even see the Christmas preparations. The Christmas tree still stands in the Christian part of Aleppo. That means there's more to come. And the only attacks, the only deaths, the only devastations in the civilian areas that we've seen so far are from Assad and Russian airstrikes, namely in Aleppo. Among other places, the Christian quarter was also hit today. We're looking at more footage from Aleppo, seeing how the first hours were right after what the Syrians call the liberation of the country. We see here many statues. This is a dictatorial country of Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, the current dictator, which were initially taken down or destroyed here in Aleppo. The rebels could barely believe that within just a few short hours they managed to accomplish what had taken years of fierce fighting for Aleppo before. We recall that there was a long blockade, a hunger blockade, and chemical weapons were deployed. All of that belongs to the past, at least for the time being, because within just a few short hours they managed to completely conquer the entire city. So quickly that only the regiment troops were gone, some of them ran away. Even without their weapons, we'll soon see, and the civilians were left behind. Here we see yet another statue of Basil al-Assad, the deceased brother of the current dictator Bashar, who has already passed away earlier. And we see him being dragged off the horse here, and as expected that too. These are very symbolic images that clearly represent, at least for many Syrians, a fresh start or new beginning. Sure, supporters of the regime say now terror rules here now. The Islamist terrorists are in charge, other Syrians say, and there are also many of them, that now finally there is a possibility again here, returning back home, that this could signify an end to the forced expulsions, and that maybe now Syria could potentially be. Claims that Mr. Jolani, who is the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, can indeed have a Syria for all its people. So far it was a Syria for only very few. As mentioned, millions were displaced, and here we see footage from the residence of dictator Assad in Aleppo. This residence was also stormed by the rebels, who are now taking a look at the whole thing here. It's somewhat similar to what we know from many other revolutions, where suddenly then the luxury of the leaders was seen, where the people or mostly armed individuals then went in. Rebels then run in and take the whole thing into consideration a bit. This whole thing, not a palace of Assad, just a residence. The dictator was rarely in Aleppo. He comes from Latakia and Tartus, located in the western part of the country near the Mediterranean. He ruled in Damascus in his palace and was only rarely in Aleppo here in the north of the country. Nevertheless, even here he had a few estates, and as we just saw, the cult of personality around him and his family was extremely large. Now the whole thing under rebel control. And we want to look at more footage from Aleppo, which shows how death and destruction are once again prevailing there. However, not death and destruction caused by the rebels, but rather by devastating airstrikes. We now see an airstrike on a large roundabout here. Many civilians died, and rebels reportedly also perished. Approximately 20 in total. That was an attack we witnessed in this location. Additionally, we observe further ongoing attacks on various neighborhoods. We see that additional attacks were also executed throughout the city. And we can still remember the last years quite well. Up until around 2016, the city of Aleppo was bombed. Yeah, it's crazy, I must say, with many thousands of deaths. And even back then, the regime and Russia did not care at all whether they were hitting rebels or civilians, but just bombed a lot. We have additional airstrikes here that we are examining in Idlib. Idlib city has also become a focal point of airstrikes since the rebel advance started, with an army, a regime army, and its militias, which have significantly retreated very far back, who have fled. However, the air force is now coming from the southern parts of the country and is attacking civilian areas and allegedly also rebels, but that's not visible here. But those are simply the cities, and we've always seen it this way in Syria, the cities where rebels control. They are being attacked, and in such a widespread manner that it affects everyone, in the hope that if you make it unfit for the civilians to live in, then even the rebels will not be able to remain there any longer. We just talked about militias, and it's actually quite interesting that suddenly many are asking, well, who are these people there? Who are these rebels? That's a terrorist organization listed in Germany that now partially has power there. Yes, up to now, a terrorist group listed in Germany, Hezbollah, held power there. However, this didn't really bother anyone around here. We are now witnessing how the flags are being pulled down in the various offices, and we clearly see how substantial the influence of Hezbollah truly was. From Iran, from the mullahs, right in the Aleppo region, which they have somewhat colonized already. We're about to see various photos here. One, I believe, is Qasem Soleimani, the former chief of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, who was killed by a drone strike ordered by Trump. And in this section, we have a larger image of Hassan Nasrallah, the prominent leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, who was ultimately killed by Israeli forces. In this scene, we observe another base that was overrun in the Aleppo region. You can also see the mullahs' flags flying there, meaning the Iranian flags that have been hung up, and also here everywhere. Clerics, that's Khamenei, if I'm seeing it correctly. There's Hafez al-Assad again, the former president or dictator of the Ba'ath Party indeed. And above that, all these sectarian slogans that show that so far Shia militias haven't had much tolerance for Sunnis and Christians. Or even in Lebanon, they fought and killed thousands of Christians, which indicates that they were controlling here in Aleppo and likewise in Idlib. Of course, the situation now is such that everything is changing very quickly, and currently we have a retreat. We'll take a detailed look at the map in just a moment. It's not only the abandoned military bases and residences, but also the newly captured cities, which have now fallen completely under the control of the rebels, but they also captured massive amounts of material. We're talking about hundreds of tanks and armored personnel carriers, mostly very old equipment. Here we see a T-55, which was just captured at a base. There are various other vehicles, including some BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, and a T-72 is also hiding in the corner. Definitely a whole lot, hundreds of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and an incredible amount of ammunition. This morning, the staggering number of 800,000 Grad rockets was circulating, which were allegedly captured by the rebels that took control there, and they are now presumably being used to, naturally, continue the war efforts. If one seeks to advance further into the southern areas or focus on defending and holding onto already secured areas. These are replica versions of Ukrainian MRAPs, manufactured instead by the Syrian government. They made attempts to replicate these vehicles, and we can observe that there are really quite a number of vehicles that managed to be captured. But we also look ahead and see that a lot could be captured in the aviation sector as well. Here we observe the Kaveri's Air Force Base located east of Aleppo, and right here in the forefront we spot an Ababil 3 drone. This also shows how tight Iran's grip on this region was, how Iran has actually controlled Syria for several years, how it controls Assad, and how this puppet just barely exists. Because the mullahs and because Putin in Moscow want to let him, behind we see an L-39 fighter jet of the Syrian Air Force. At least 3 of them were also captured, still operational. We observe more radar installations, presumably originating from Russia, and additional equipment at various Air Force bases. Altogether, 3 Air Force bases were captured by the rebels successfully within the time frame of just a few hours. What's remaining there, and the fact that these planes are still parked there and haven't flown away by even the 3rd day, is, of course, naturally, as we also see S-8 rockets and varied stored ammunition here. Of course, the whole thing is a bit insidious and also leaves the question open whether it was really just the rebels who moved Assad away or caused the Syrian army to withdraw like that almost without fighting in the Idlib region and in the Aleppo region. Or are there external influences here, or maybe even generals in Damascus who have been promised something and therefore somehow support this rebel offensive because there was hardly any resistance? Here we see a Tunguska air defense system. It was also captured from various rebel units now posing for the cameras. We have, as mentioned earlier, many more weapons and devices that are currently under rebel control and can no longer be used by the Assad regime. This marks a notable shift in the dynamics of the conflict. To better understand the whole picture, let's take a look at the big map. Let's see what's happened there over the last 5 days. And let's start by looking at Syria. Now have the Life UA map of Syria, which precisely tracks the geopolitical situation, meaning the distribution in the country on a daily basis. And that showcased the situation we observed last Tuesday, at which time a significant part of the northwest region of the country was under regime control, particularly the major city of Aleppo, serving as a noteworthy example. But also other occupied cities like Khan Sheikhoun, like Sarakib, around here like Marad al-Numan, all former cities from which up to 100,000 people have fled, mostly to Turkey, but also to Germany during the various offensives. Particularly during the year of 2020, assuming my memory is accurate, were overtaken and captured by the Syrian regime in conjunction with its allies from both Iran and Russia. But we also have the situation that north of Aleppo, with various Kurdish groups, or rather by the SDF, which are the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's a Syrian organization close to the PKK, by the way, also a terrorist organization in Germany, that they were controlled. And we have a small part here in the north of the country, in the northwest of the country, around Idlib and around Aleppo, which was controlled by various rebel groups. Around Idlib, primarily Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, meaning this hardcore Islamists who had held the whole thing under control there, who were simply the largest group over time and everything north of here. You can see here something like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and in this region here we had this Syrian National Army. Naturally, this was also supported by Turkey. These troops were intended to establish a kind of buffer zone against the Kurdish forces, such as those of the SDF, YPG, or even PKK in Syria. So that's the situation. Last Tuesday, and we're now taking a look at what happened, what transpired in this region here within just 5 days, and we now see a massive territorial gain for the Syrian rebels. A territory was captured that's approximately 7 times the size of Berlin, or 3 times the size of the Saarland, which has now come under the control of the rebels. And we can observe that not only is Aleppo itself currently completely under the control of the rebels, however, you have also extended the reach about 70 to 80 kilometers further, both to the south as well as to the east from that initial location. Also south of Al-Bab, everything has been taken over. And we see that here in the south of the Idlib region, it's almost completely liberated from Assad's rule. And that we now even have the situation here where we have about 5 cities in Hama back under rebel control. Hama was briefly entered by the rebels, who then withdrew without a fight. Strange circumstances, if you ask me. And at this point, the regime has managed to gain a foothold and is establishing a new front in this area, with the objective of defending the Hama region, at least to a significant extent, to fight the detested and by Turkey-backed rebels. So the situation now in the northwest of the country, where many people, as mentioned, are happy who had lived in these refugee areas here along the front, that was along the border, and it was mainly this specific region where about 2 million people had been living in refugee camps who unfortunately couldn't get out of Syria, when in 2020 the major military offensive was launched there by Assad, Putin and the mullahs, who are now currently attempting to come back into the region. Let's let it run a bit more and see the overall situation in the country. And when we go out, we'll notice that geographically speaking, there is still a large part, namely most of the country remains under regime control, including the capital Damascus, as well as Homs, Deir Sur and other major cities. However, if we look at the population density perspective, we see that by now a relatively large part of the country, about 20 to 30%, is under rebel control. Because in these vast desert areas hardly anyone lives, especially in the expansive regions of Homs here on the right, also here in Deir Sur. Hardly anyone actually lives there. That means we only have in the north, of course, in the SDF areas, we have a few, yes, probably over 1 million inhabitants. And indeed, the rest actually lives in these strips. Let's mark it briefly. So in roughly this strip, most of the inhabitants in Syria live. And there we see we already have a division which definitely gives Assad, if he's still in power at all. Even that's not completely clear. It has undoubtedly been exceptionally tough for him. So this remains the current situation in Syria. At the end, we want to revisit what I mentioned earlier, namely that yes, many people are returning. And we are now seeing some activists who have returned to their old homeland after many years and are extremely happy about it. That the rebels here have recaptured cities, villages, in fact over 400 cities and villages, and they are now able to return to their, for the most part, unfortunately destroyed, but ultimately return to their homeland, to their birthplaces. This situation, it must be said, completely reshuffles the deck in Syria and possibly the entire region. Russia, as we are well aware, was one of the key allies of the Assad regime, but now can hardly offer any help, as most of the warplanes have been withdrawn from Syria and are actively engaged in Ukraine. Iran was also a key ally of the Assad regime with Hezbollah and other militias. Even that can hardly help anymore because they wanted to avoid a war with Israel, both in Lebanon and in direct confrontation. That means the major allies. The strong support of the Assad regime is otherwise occupied is partly also distracted, preventing him from helping there. And this is something Turkey has clearly exploited with its allies in the region to create facts on the ground and perhaps also to lead to that the 4 million Syrian refugees currently living in Turkey may be able to return to their homeland soon under certain circumstances.